Decision to grant former Zimbabwe First Lady Grace Mugabe diplomatic immunity, that is, was inconsistent with the Constitution. That was the ruling by the South Gauteng High Court. It's also set aside the decision. Mugabe was granted a diplomatic immunity after Gabriela Engels opened an assault case against her. She was allowed to leave the country without being prosecuted. Let's talk more about this with Bronwyn Pithey, an attorney at the Women's Legal Centre. And of course, they're the friends of the court in this case. Bronwyn, being one of the applicants in this matter, perhaps give us your reaction to today's court ruling setting aside that decision.
Yeah, the Women's Legal Centre obviously welcomes the decision because we, as you mentioned, were involved in the matter as a friend of the court. And the main intention of us joining the court was to bring a gendered aspect to the case. So obviously the main points of law were around the granting of spousal immunity or derivative immunity to Mrs. Mugabe by virtue of the fact that she was the spouse of the head of state, who at that time was Mr. Mugabe. And we really raised issues to look at the impact of violence against women in this country and to draw the court's attention to the profound effects of that violence and how there is a responsibility on leadership in this country to take those things very seriously and to act on them and to not act contrary to the constitutional principles, which obviously protect women from violence, and then also all our international obligations which have been put in place and signed by South Africa to comply with obligations to protect women and to respect their rights.
Bronwyn, in terms of court process and legal process from here on, how would you like to see this matter unfold? Because we just heard from Advocate Paul Hoffman there, who said there are many loopholes through which the Zimbabwean First Lady could eventually escape any kind of prosecution on this matter. But what would you like to see happen?
Well, look, I mean, you know, not only in this case, but I think it's very important that we have to deal very carefully and clearly with the issue of impunity, whether that is individual people who are perpetrating violence or leadership, the state, government, who's not protecting people from violence. So, you know, like this case, like any other case, like any other complainant or any other victim or survivor of violence would like to see people and perpetrators being brought before the law so that the courts can make decisions on them. So in terms of this case in particular, the way is now been made for a prosecution to proceed if and when Mrs. Mugabe ever comes back to South Africa. But I don't think that necessarily, you know, our energy certainly won't go into necessarily pursuing this individual case. I think that there are enough people, hopefully, that will be acting in the interests of Ms. Engels, the complainant. Our issue is really in terms of looking at the broader implications of matters like this and literally the thousands of women who have violence perpetrated against them, whether it's in domestic situations, sexual violence. That is really where our energy goes, that we have to have a state who's responsible and responds in a way that realizes the rights of women.
So if I understand you correctly, part of why you pursued this case was mainly on the issue of principle and legal precedent that has been set and trying to change the fundamentals that went into that decision.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The work of the Women's Legal Centre is to do litigation which establishes broad legal principles and tries to develop feminist jurisprudence on matters that affect women. So in this particular case, we were focusing on violence, but we focus on a number of other areas in terms of the issues that affect women, whether it's housing or relationships, land. So, you know, that's really the impetus around which we work, to establish broad principles that can be implemented in a wide-ranging way that can protect women.